May 1945. The country that had attempted to dominate an entire continent ceases to exist as a government. There is no partial surrender, there is no truce, there is no successor cabinet. The four victors, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and France, do something no power had done before with a nation of 70 million people. They take it whole, from top to bottom, town hall by town hall, school by school, and administer it as if it were their own. Imagine 70 million people waking up one morning without a state, without their own police, without a currency to trust in, without a government to complain to. Only foreign soldiers, maps with new lines drawn in pencil over their territory, and the question that will haunt each of them for years. What did you do between 1933 and 1945? This is not a story about the end of the war. It is about what comes after, which almost no one tells, about entire cities reduced to rubble and women raped by the hundreds of thousands, about children eating bread crust soaked in water because there is nothing else, about executioners with perfect alibis and honest bureaucrats accused without evidence, about a country divided into four pieces that, in less than 5 years, will become the first battlefield of a different, Cold War, which will last another 4 decades. This happened. It is documented in archives of the four occupying armies, in private diaries, in court transcripts, in letters that never reached their destination because the postman had also disappeared. This is what happened to Germany after Hitler. January 12, 1945, along a front of several hundred kilometers between the Baltic Sea and the Bohemian Forest, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers launched the offensive that will end Germany. They outnumber the German army group 5-1, in tanks 6-1, in artillery the same ratio, in self-propelled guns 4-1. The Red Army advances between 30 and 40 kilometers daily. Historical cities like Königsberg, the 1,000-year-old capital of East Prussia with 300,000 inhabitants before the war, and Breslau, the capital of Silesia with 650,000, are besieged in a matter of weeks. What breaks out east of the Elbe River is, according to contemporary historians, the largest movement of population in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Millions of civilians, women, children, the elderly, because almost all adult men are dead or at the front, abandon their homes with whatever they can carry in carts and wheelbarrows, heading west under temperatures reaching 20 degrees below zero that will not abate until late March. The hatred driving the Soviet army is not abstract. 25 million Soviets have died in combat, massacred or deliberately starved in a war of aggression that Germany chose to wage without the slightest rules of humanity. When the Russian soldiers finally cross the border and discover that the Germans, the supposed people without sufficient living space, lived on prosperous farms with livestock, orchards and apple trees, the fury intensifies. A Soviet soldier, according to testimony gathered from an officer, asks his captain how they should treat those people. They were well off, well fed, they had cattle, orchards and apple trees, and they invaded us. For this, captain, we should strangle them. A 16-year-old girl, Katharina Elliger, originally from Upper Silesia, flees with her mother toward the county of Glatz, in Lower Silesia. On the way, one night they arrive at an isolated farm. Inside, lights are on. Around a round oak table, 6 or 7 people are on their knees, completely motionless, with their heads slumped forward. Upon approaching, they discover they have been nailed to the table by their tongues. Later, they learn that Slavic neighbors from the area had passed through seeking revenge against local Germans. The detail of the nail in the tongue, as historians interpret it, seems like a symbolic reprisal against the language of the former master race as much as against the bodies. A young ensign of the Wehrmacht from a prominent Silesian family describes what his panzer unit found upon temporarily reclaiming a Sudeten village. What we found there cannot be easily described with words. Houses full of dead, hanged men, raped women wandering half-maddened through the streets, children with their bellies cut open. If I am honest, I must say, this is something of which one has suppressed the memory. The same youth, too young to have served on the Eastern Front, wonders later what the Germans had done there for so many Russian soldiers to act with such beastly fury. In the port of Königsberg, An evacuation takes place that some historians compare to Dunkirk. More than 1,000 vessels, military and civilian, managed to take out hundreds of thousands of refugees across the frozen Baltic. But the operation has a cost that makes it the greatest maritime catastrophe in history. A Soviet submarine sinks the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former passenger cruiser overloaded with refugees, named after a Swiss Nazi leader assassinated in 1936. 8,000 people die, the vast majority civilians. 8,000 dead in a single sinking in a single night, in a sea that was already frozen. Breslau, on the other hand, has no outlet to the sea, and its defense is, as historians describe it, completely useless from a military standpoint. Gauleiter Karl Hanke, only 42 years old, former undersecretary of the Ministry of Propaganda and supposed lover of Goebbels' wife, prohibits civil evacuation until it is already too late. From the end of March, children as young as 10 and pregnant women are forced to work in labor gangs under enemy fire, building barricades with dynamited buildings. The forced construction of a second airstrip in the very center of the city, which ends up being used by only a handful of planes, costs, according to the most cited figures, up to 13,000 civilian lives in that project alone. Hanke escapes from Breslau in a light aircraft 3 days before the war ends, ironically taking off from the same runway that had cost so many lives to build. He is captured by the Czechs a little over a month later, disguised as a private soldier of the SS. He dies in captivity, according to different versions, shot while trying to escape or beaten to death. Aachen falls on October 21, 1944. It is the first major German city to pass into Allied hands, and before that it was the city where Charlemagne was crowned, the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, over 1,100 years ago. Now, 85% of its buildings are in ruins. The first United States Army, under the command of General Courtney Hodges, has spent 3 weeks trying to encircle it. The original German commander, Lieutenant General von Schwerin, a man linked to the July 20 plot against Hitler, had wanted to hand over the city without a fight. He was relieved in time. His replacement, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, orders resistance until the end. 5,000 casualties between both sides, 3 weeks of house-to-house combat, for a city that, as Hodges himself had been advised, could simply be bypassed and left behind. And then comes the problem that will haunt the Allies for the next 4 years. Who governs this now? The majority of the inhabitants of the left bank of the Rhine were never especially Nazi. Before 1933, they voted for the Catholic Center Party. Hitler's party barely pulled 20% here. The Americans know it. They have intelligence reports confirming it. But knowing that does not solve the practical problem of finding someone clean to govern a city in ruins. The Catholic Bishop of Aachen recommends a name, Franz Oppenhoff, a 42-year-old lawyer, former member of the Center Party, who never joined the Nazi Party after 1933. The American officer Leo Svoboda appoints him mayor. They swear him in before a United States flag. They ask him if he has a house. Yes, he replies with dry humor, but it is no longer standing. And he goes to live in the basement of his new office. Oppenhoff works through the entire winter. He is efficient. No one finds fault in him. But 400 kilometers away, at an airbase near Hanover, someone has already decided that a mayor appointed by the Americans is a traitor who deserves to die. The organization is called werewolf. The name comes from a popular 1910 novel, Der Werwolf, by Hermann Lohns, about guerrillas resisting an occupying army. Heinrich Himmler turns it into something darker, a network of clandestine commandos who must act behind enemy lines once the front has passed them. At the head is SS General Hans Adolf Pritzmann, 43 years old, veteran of the extermination squads on the Eastern Front. He establishes his headquarters at Rheinsberg Castle, where Frederick the Great lived while still Crown Prince, and travels on a private train to inspect weapon and food bunkers spread along the western border. Up to 30 underground shelters built by Ruhr miners await teams of 6 to 10 men who are to sabotage bridges, railway lines, parked enemy vehicles. The operation against Oppenhoff receives the codename Carnival. Originally, it was planned for mid-February, coinciding with the start of Lent, but the military situation deteriorates and it does not take off until the night of March 19, 1945. The commando, made up of adult men, a radio operator and 2 teenagers from the Hitler Youth, among them a young woman named Ilse Hirsch, boards a captured B-17, repainted with Luftwaffe insignia at the Hildesheim Air Base. They parachute over Dutch territory near the border, calculating that security there would be less strict than inside Germany. The first death of the operation is not Oppenhoff. It is a Dutch border guard only a few years older than the saboteurs themselves, Jost Saever, who stops them as they cross a wooded path. They shoot him without hesitation. Some reports suggest it was the 16-year-old Hitlerjugend himself who fired first, and he bleeds to death that same night at the border post, having been unable to tell his superiors anything more than this. The ones responsible were Germans. On March 25, Palm Sunday, they finally arrive at Oppenhoff's house. They cut the telephone wires. They enter through the basement. They find the teenage maid Elizabeth Gillison hiding under the sheets, convinced they are American soldiers. When she discovers they speak German, she relaxes and goes to find the mayor, who is at a farewell gathering at a neighbor's house. Oppenhoff comes out to the garden to speak with them. He tells them he cannot help them with documentation, that they should surrender to the Americans. But, like a good German, he decides to give them something to eat before sending them away. While he waits for the maid to prepare some sandwiches in the basement, he goes up the stairs and meets the 2 men head-on, blocking his way. The head of the commando, Wenzel, holds a Walter pistol with a silencer. He does not fire. He loses his nerve at the last second, and neither does he inform him, as he was ordered, that he has been sentenced to death in absentia. It is his companion, Leitgeb, who snatches the weapon from his hands and, without saying a word, shoots him in the left temple. Oppenhoff falls backward down the stairs. The assassins flee upon hearing shots. They are not of reprisal. They are from a signal unit of the United States Army that has come to investigate the cut in the telephone line. The news takes 4 days to reach the international press. The Associated Press wire speaks of an execution gangster style. Goebbels' propaganda machinery squeezes the case for weeks, announces reprisals against all collaborators, puts Radio Werwolf on the air. But Goebbels himself writes in his diary those same days that in some areas of the Western Front the population receives the Americans with white flags, that some women embrace the enemy soldiers, that the troops do not want to keep fighting. Ilse Hirsch and the rest of the commando flee separately after the murder. It takes months for them to be discovered, and only years after the war ended is their connection to the crime established with certainty. Werwolf never becomes what Himmler dreamed of. It is an orphaned organization from the start, without its own command, deliberately isolated from the central bureaucracy of the SS, dependent on special orders that almost never arrive. The murder of Oppenhoff is, in reality, its most noted success and almost its only one. But it leaves a mark. It proves to the victors something they will remember throughout the occupation. Appointing a clean German to govern other Germans guarantees nothing. It doesn't even guarantee he will stay alive.
Not all enemies of the occupation carried a pistol. In the small medieval village of Monschau, occupied by the Americans since September 14, 1944, lived a 17-year-old teenager named Maria Birgans, an enthusiastic member of the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. Birgans and her family, along with 1,500 of the village's 2,000 permanent residents, decided to stay when the Allies arrived. During the Ardennes offensive, the bulk of the German advance passed just a few kilometers to the south. For a time, there were combats in the very outskirts of the village, but Monschau remained in American hands. American counterintelligence services discover her when they see her speaking in the street with a young leader of the Hitler Youth, moments before he is arrested for sabotage. They search her room, they find her diary, and the diary tells a very different story from that of an innocent girl chatting with a schoolmate. Birgans had founded, along with a handful of equally fanatical youths, a clandestine organization called the Club of Those Loyal to the Fatherland. In its pages, she writes with contempt about the Americans. The American is a comical soldier. He stands guard with an umbrella. They are not soldiers. They are fans of jitterbug and tango, but fight and advance are words they do not know. I hate the Americans. One thing they will not be able to take from us: we will begin our new life under the old principle they taught us: to live is to fight. She is arrested on January 6, 1945. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, heavy footsteps were heard coming up the stairs of our house, she would remember years later. 2 armed military police and several counterintelligence agents were in front of me. "Are you Maria Biergans?" "Yes." "Mitkommen. Come on. Before her mother's anguished questions about what they planned to do with her, the officers replied dryly, "Court-martial." In reality, she has never tried. Her crimes were only that, words in a diary, and American military justice, even in the middle of war, retains enough integrity not to prosecute her for thoughts. She is returned to her home on March 4, 1945, still clinging to her ideals but increasingly disillusioned with the obvious cynicism of the Nazi leadership and less convinced that the final victory would ever arrive. A high-ranking American officer even offers her a position as an advisor on German youth. She rejects it, although she admits that the American military she had contact with behaved in a fair and friendly manner. Goebbels, meanwhile, does not miss the opportunity. In a radio speech at the end of February, he invents a trial that never happened, in which Biergans supposedly behaved as a heroine in the shadow of death, defying her American judges with holy wrath. "We all know," he thunders over the radio, "that this girl spoke in our name and that this daughter of our people spoke for the entire Volk." They illustrate his statements with drawings of the Aryan maiden defying her presumed executioners. The propaganda does not achieve the sought-after effect, but there are exceptions. 3 weeks after that lie went on the air, 2 equally convinced youths board the plane of Operation Carnival heading to Aachen, where one of them, barely older than Biergans, fires the first fatal shot of the mission against the Dutch border guard. The case of Biergans, compared with the fate of Oppenhoff just weeks later, illustrates 2 sides of the same coin. That of a teenager whose fanaticism in the hands of American justice ended in a couple of months of house arrest and a progressive disappointment with the regime, and that of a middle-aged mayor whose only crime was trying to govern, executed in cold blood by compatriots convinced they were doing the right thing.
December 1944. Barely a fragment of Germany is under Allied control, and already at a training school in England, a senior officer instructs future military administrators with a sentence that needs no adornment. The German adult will receive 1,500 calories a day at most, and that is not guaranteed. That is all they are going to have during the occupation. He continues with brutal clarity. As for supplying food to the Germans, it will be only as a last resort. We are going to treat Germany as a defeated country. Whoa. We do not want circumstances to force us to import food for the Germans. For the figure to make sense, it must be compared. Before the war, in 1939, the average German adult consumed around 2,900 calories a day, 10% above the European average, with higher fat content than the continent's average. That figure remained above 2,000 calories until the summer of 1944, when the loss of productive territories in the occupied East and then in eastern Germany itself, added to the destruction of railway and river networks by Allied bombing, caused a collapse in the standard of living. Just before Victory in Europe Day, average rationed consumption had fallen to 1,050 calories daily, and after the surrender it fell another 200 calories more. A week after the war ends, in Berlin, the daily rations are these. Workers in heavy occupations receive 600 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat, 25 of sugar, and monthly 100 grams of real coffee. Office employees, 400 grams of bread and 10 grams of fat, with only 25 grams of real coffee per month. Children, 300 grams of bread and 20 of meat. People who do not produce, the elderly, sick, unemployed, and also former Nazis receive 300 grams of bread, 7 of fat, 15 of sugar. In Berlin slang, that last card has a nickname, the death card. By early 1946, the figures by occupation zone are these: 1,330 calories in the American zone, 1,083 in the Soviet, 1,050 in the British, 900 in the French. To compare with a modern parameter, heavy work requires around 3,400 calories daily, moderately heavy, such as that of a housewife with children, 2,800, and light activity, 2,200. The vast majority of Germans are not simply hungry, they are dying of hunger, slowly, in a generalized manner. There is also fine print on the rationing cards warning that the quantities listed were no guarantee. Sometimes the product was not available or was replaced by something inferior. Sausages, bacon, or margarine could come injected with water so that the weight was correct, but the real caloric value much lower. Why does no one intervene? Because the decision had already been made before the war ended. The instructions that Washington sends to Eisenhower on May 10, 1945, speak of guaranteeing only the supplies necessary to prevent starvation, widespread disease, or civil unrest that would endanger the occupying forces, not a dignified life. The minimum so that chaos does not break out. The same logic applies to the 5 or 6 million Wehrmacht soldiers captured in the final weeks of the war. Instead of treating them as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention as international law required and as had been done until months before, the Western Allies reclassify them as disarmed enemy forces or surrendered enemy personnel, an ambiguous legal category designed to dodge the obligation to feed them at the same level as their own troops. And here is an irony that the historical narrative itself cannot avoid pointing out. The same Franz Oppenhoff, the mayor of Aachen who would be murdered that same spring, spent the afternoon of his death planting vegetables with his wife in the garden of his house, preparing for a post-war winter he would never live to see. The black market inevitably becomes the real economy of the country. An American cigarette is worth more than a 100-mark bill. A single cigarette equals a suburban train ticket, a whole pack, a considerable bribe. In October 1945, one cigarette is exchanged for 120 grams of bread. In a prisoner of war camp, they come to cost 120 marks each. Railway stations, often the only structures left standing in the center of many cities, become permanent markets. Offers of butter, lard, flour, coffee, chocolate, jewelry are heard. A camera is exchanged for a kilo of dried peas and a rind of bacon. On another occasion, for a whole goose. There are constant raids. Small ones are done by the German police, focused on prostitutes whom they examine in clinics and return to the station with a clean hunting certificate. The large raids are done by foreign military police, and whoever falls spends the night in a cell without anyone considering it a disgrace, because in those years there are too many Germans imprisoned for equally innocent reasons. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, up to 60,000 Germans, mostly elderly, die of cold and hunger. It is then that American General Lucius Clay sends an urgent message to Washington. There is no hope of introducing democracy into a population that is dying of hunger. Help arrives late, but it arrives. The Kralog organization distributes 30,000 tons of food by early 1947. In April 1946, CARE joins in, and the package that still bears its name today is born. In 1946 alone, 1,900,000 units are distributed. But before that, for almost 2 years, the question that defines daily survival in Germany is not political, nor moral, nor ideological. It is much simpler and much more brutal. What am I going to eat today? To each German adult, they hand a paper. It is called Fragebogen, questionnaire. In it, they must respond with sincerity about their political past, their affiliation, their activities during 12 years of dictatorship. On that answer depends their status in the new Germany. The problem is the scale. 45 million people have passed through the Nazi Party or one of its affiliated organizations, the Labour Front, the Hitler Youth, National Socialist Social Welfare, each with more than 10 million members. If everyone were punished equally with the loss of employment, Half the population would be reduced to economic inactivity in a country that needs every productive hand available just to be able to pay for food. So a classification is designed. Who joined before January 30, 1933, when Hitler comes to power? Those, around 1.5 million, are considered a convinced hardcore. Who joined in the wave that followed the elections of March of that year, the so-called Märzgefallenen, the March fallen, when joining the party seemed to guarantee the future? Those are considered, in general, opportunists. Who entered after 1937 when the ban on new affiliates, originally imposed by direct order of Hitler to prevent the party from being flooded with careerists, was relaxed? Most of them are categorized as Muss-Nazis, Nazis by obligation, people who joined simply to keep their jobs. There are 5 possible levels of classification, from major criminal to exonerated. The line between them is sometimes as thin as the signature on a paper. In the Soviet zone, however, things work differently. The father of historian Götz Bergander, a chemist at a distillery in Dresden, a passive member of the Nazi Party, is interrogated by the new authorities. 3 things count in his favor. He treated his foreign workers well, and they confirmed it to the Soviet occupiers. He gave employment to a local communist activist recently out of a concentration camp, a gesture technically illegal at the time, and quite simply the Soviets need him, Nazi or not. When the Soviets planned to dismantle his distillery and send it whole to Russia, they summon him to their local command post. The family waits hours in anguish, convinced he is not coming back. And then at nightfall comes the noise of vehicles, of boots on the stairs. The door flies open. And stumbling in, laughing, talking animatedly with his uniformed Russian companions, comes Dr. Bergander, drunk, something no one in the family had ever seen. They have decided not to dismantle the factory. What they want now is another round of schnapps. That night, according to the account by the chemist's own son, it was young Götz who had to run to look for more schnapps from the distillery's own reserves, while his mother searched through the pantry, almost empty, for something to offer their Soviet guests to eat. Not all cases end with an improvised party. Meanwhile, the Americans wage their own version, much more calculated, of the same dilemma. In the Harz Mountains region, where the Mittelwerke underground complex is located, where V-2 rockets were manufactured, American intelligence teams enter just hours after the occupation. Between April and July 1945, before having to hand over the area to the Soviets, they take out of the country 400 tons of equipment in a single 8-day period bound for Antwerp and from there to New Orleans. And under a secret program called First Overcast, later renamed Paperclip, 765 German engineers and scientists who worked on Hitler's missile program are moved to the United States without going through any denazification process. One of them, Arthur Rudolph, had been directly responsible for the treatment of slave workers at Mittelwerke, whose mortality rate was appallingly high. Initially, they had marked him as a 100% dangerous Nazi and recommended for internment. He was not the only one. Honest officials from the State Department refused for months to issue them entry documents, waging a bureaucratic battle against parts of the army itself. The knot breaks at the beginning of 1947, when General George Marshall, newly appointed Secretary of State, declares without further ado that national security takes priority over the imperatives of denazification. The Soviets are not left behind. They operate their own version of the program under the codename Osavakim, recruiting German rocket and weapons scientists with similar methods and, according to available records, with relatively decent treatment, often attracted by privileges of rations and housing that few ordinary Germans could dream of in those years. The British do the same on a smaller scale with their own recruitment of weapons specialists. And the French do not stay out. In June 1945, American researchers transporting by car through territory under French administration Otto Ambros, chief scientist of IG Farben, arrested for leading chemical weapons projects linked to the Auschwitz factory, are detained by the French authorities themselves, who keep the prisoner. It turns out that Ambros's complex in Ludwigshafen is precisely within their assigned zone. What does this mean in practice? That while an unimportant peasant could lose his job for having been a nominal member of the party, a rocket scientist with direct responsibility for the death of slave workers could receive a contract, a house, and a future in California, Moscow, or London. Justice, in those first years, is not measured only in guilt, it is also measured in utility. In the British occupation zone, denazification follows in appearance the same mould as the American one, the endless Fragebogen, the 5 categories, the arrests of presumed convinced Nazis. But there is a key difference. The British, unlike the Americans, do not force every adult over 18 to fill out the questionnaire. It is only required of those who work or seek work in public offices or companies relevant to the state. That rule produces almost absurd situations. The official George Clare, in charge of denazification in the media and entertainment sectors in post-war Berlin, describes the scene he found one day upon entering his office. It was full of tiny people, standing on chairs around the table, filling out their forms. They turned out to be performers from a well-known circus troupe of dwarves, the Lilliputians, whom someone had decided to classify as media operators sensitive to security because they performed in front of the public. By June 1946, 66,000 Germans had been arrested and sent to civil internment camps, or, in the most serious cases, to prison. In a single month, 24,000 were released, leaving 42,000 still detained. 500 came to trial. During the more than 2 years following the end of the war in Europe, the British evaluated 2 million Fragebogen and excluded about 350,000 Germans from public office. The inconsistency, however, is notable. In the province of Oldenburg, under British control, 41% of those working in food production and distribution were fired for their Nazi backgrounds, as were 31% of railway employees and 30% of postal workers. A potato merchant from the North Rhine area, Paul Kisterman, considered by the British themselves as essential for food distribution in his semi-rural community in the midst of shortages, loses his license because of his Nazi past. The consequences for the local population, as the British documents themselves admit, were immediate and negative, and in almost suspicious contrast, only 9% of teachers and 8% of police were dismissed in that same province, despite the fact that both professions had a reputation for having been especially Nazified during the 12 years of the regime. Even more serious is what occurs in Bad Nendorf, a former elegant spa near Hanover. In June 1945, the British opened there the Combined Interrogation Centre No. 74, installed in a hotel with mud baths, whose rooms formerly intended for thermal cures, are now cells with steel doors. The initial intention is to interrogate suspects of Nazi activities, or the SS who might resist the occupation. In a short time, it becomes a torture center used first against ex-Nazis and, surprisingly soon considering that the Soviets had been allies until recently, also against presumed communist agents. The inmates are subjected to extreme cold, beatings, sleep deprivation, threats against their families, hunger, and even instruments of torture such as thumb screws and shin screws. Some weigh less than 45 kilos when investigators finally access the center. 3 die from the privations suffered. The strange thing is that many of the victims were not even German. One, supposedly French, turned out to be a Russian intelligence agent. Others were Germans who had fled the Soviet zone and, horrified by what they had seen, offered to spy for the West. They were tortured to check if their desertion was genuine. One detainee who had previously spent 2 years in Gestapo custody declared later, "Never in those 2 years did I suffer treatment like this." The scandal only comes to light when the death of an inmate and the serious illness of others in January 1947 forced London to send a police inspector. The result is media coverage, the closure of the camp, and a court-martial. The commander of the centre, Colonel Robin Stevens, nicknamed Tin Eye, a veteran of the Peshawar Division of the Indian Army turned MI5 officer, is prosecuted along with several of his interrogators. The complete story only becomes public in the 21st century, thanks to the British Freedom of Information Act. Barely 3 months after Bad Nendorf closed, a new interrogation centre is opened near Gütersloh, this time not for Nazis, but for suspects of Soviet espionage. Most of the interrogators employed had worked before at Bad Nendorf. British industrial policy follows a similar pattern of inconsistency. In September 1945, almost the entire top management of Krupp is detained and sent to an internment camp. On December 1, 76 senior executives of other Ruhr industrial giants are arrested, including Thyssen and Hirsch. But, in parallel, the British actively encourage the creation of works councils controlled by unions, a measure that clashes with their own initial caution toward any structure that could destabilize the economic status quo of their zone.
The French zone is, of the four, the smallest. Fewer than 6 million inhabitants, in a territory shaped like an hourglass attached to Alsace and Lorraine, governed from the elegant spa town of Baden-Baden. Its towns, except for Koblenz, have suffered relatively little physical damage compared to the rest of Germany, and its lands, including the famous vineyards of the Middle Rhine and the Moselle, are agriculturally rich. France had not participated in the agreement among the Big Three powers to accept refugees expelled from the East in an orderly and humane way, so it simply refuses to receive them. During the winter of 1945 to 1946, thousands of refugees who already lived in territory under French administration, some for months, with jobs and roots, are put on trains and sent to neighboring zones, mainly the British one. Beyond the simple refusal to saturate their zone with refugees who would need food and housing, the French have a plan of their own, to keep their part of Germany relatively homogeneous, encouraging the separatism of the southern Rhine from the rest of the country. When British and American protests forced them to accept some refugees at the end of 1945, the French make sure to give preference to Catholics, thus preventing waves of Prussian Protestants from altering the religious character of their provinces. In December 1945, the president of the German government for the district of Koblenz writes to his French superiors a statement that summarizes without ambiguity the logic behind this policy. The Catholic character of the region would be diluted by the resettlement of Eastern Germans, mostly Protestant, and that would be very undesirable given the relationship with Catholic France. Furthermore, he warns among that tide of refugees would come innumerable National Socialists of all shades who would act secretly as carriers of Hitlerite ideas. Prejudice against refugees from the East is not exclusive to the French. In many rural areas of Western and Northwestern Germany, Silesians and East Prussians are treated with contempt, disparagingly called Poles or Little Russians, but only in the French zone did the occupying authorities themselves actively collaborate with that prejudice. For the French, as for the British, denazification is above all a matter of security, aggravated by a long-shared border with Germany and centuries of mutual invasions. A geographical concern not shared by the Soviets, with their new cordell of satellite states, nor the British on the other side of the Channel, and much less the Americans separated from Europe by 5,000 kilometers of Atlantic. The French record regarding German prisoners of war also is not irreproachable. It is calculated that at least 30,000, possibly more, died in French captivity from hunger, disease, neglect, and mistreatment. Around 5,000 would have died in the labor of clearing minefields alone. The International Red Cross considered the French, after the Soviets, the most reprehensible among the great powers in their treatment of German prisoners. In April 1945, moreover, the French troops advancing through southwestern Germany commit episodes of rape and pillage documented in their own advance. And there is a diplomatic incident that illustrates to what point France was willing to take its interests. On April 21, 1945, French troops occupy Stuttgart, capital of Württemberg, formally assigned to the American zone, and refuse to evacuate it despite a direct order from American General Devers to his French counterpart, General de Lattre de Tassigny. Charles de Gaulle seems to see the city as a useful bargaining chip. Only on July 8, after Eisenhower threatened to cut off all their supplies, do the French finally withdraw.
If there is an episode that condenses the violence of the mass expulsions of Germans from the East, it is what occurs in Brno, in Czechoslovakia, in the spring and summer of 1945. Before the First World War, Brno was considered almost a suburb of Vienna. Despite previous migration, it retained 60,000 German-speaking inhabitants when the Red Army enters the city on April 25, 1945. There follow, according to the testimonies gathered, the usual scenes of rape and violence. The next morning, all Germans must present themselves for forced labor. Czech partisans established their headquarters at Kaunitz College, where they beat and torture the city's most prominent Germans, forcing them on occasion to walk on all fours and bark like dogs. A Red Cross nurse examines a German with indescribable wounds in the genitals. Before dying, the man manages to explain his crime. He had sold vegetables to the Gestapo. On May 30, 1945, at 9 o'clock at night, the so-called Brno Death March begins. It is the feast of Corpus Christi, traditionally a day of solemn processions, and the city's Germans, mostly Catholic, do not fail to notice the contrast. 25,000 people have 15 minutes to pack a suitcase and gather in the garden of a convent, where they spend the night. At dawn, they are stripped of their valuables and forced to march under torrential rain toward a camp in Regen. Among the marchers are elderly from an asylum, patients from hospitals, children from a children's clinic, and an Englishwoman married to a local Nazi, whose case sparks the interest of the British press. The stragglers are beaten with clubs and whips. Those who fail to get up are shot and their bodies stripped of clothing and belongings. A Red Cross nurse claims that by that point 1,000 people had already died. Another witness raises the figure from the following camp in Porlitz to 1,700 lives. One mother recounts that 2 of her 3 children died during the march. The younger women are raped by the guards in a car factory converted into lodging. Those who can still walk are pushed toward the Austrian border, leaving behind some 6,000 people who end up crowded in grain silos. The Porlitz camp is evacuated on June 18th. Between 60 and 70 people die daily, mostly from typhus. The food consists of stale bread and rotten vegetables. Russian soldiers arrive every night at 7:30 and stay until 2 in the morning, raping the women, including one 70 years old. When the Red Cross nurse tries to protect an 11-year-old girl, she herself is taken and raped by 5 soldiers. Another witness claims that the youngest victim was 7 years old and the oldest 80. The purpose, as emerges from the testimonies, was for Brno to be free of Germans in time for the 5-day visit of Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš in July. Since the Czechs do not manage to gather all the Germans in time and others who had stayed behind on the march are returned to the city, when Beneš arrives, they are expelled towards sand dunes without water or food. Many die, others go mad. The first to leave Porlitz are the sick taken and abandoned in the marshes next to the Thaya River on the Austrian border. No one knew they were there, and according to the Red Cross nurse, they die of hunger without anyone helping them. The corpses are photographed and appear in newsreels in Great Britain and the United States. The Czechs respond, alleging it was the Austrians who killed them. There is another massacre in Nikolsburg, where the bodies of 614 men are thrown into a mass grave. Similar episodes are repeated in Iglau in western Moravia, where the fall of the city on May 5 provokes a collective suicide. Up to 1,200 Germans take their own lives, and by Christmas the death toll would reach some 2,000. Between 6,000 and 7,000 are led to the camps of Helenenthal and Altenburg. When the former is closed, its inhabitants are plundered and led toward the Austrian border, losing about 350 lives on the way. In Kladno, a 17-year-old teenager, Erika Griesmann, sees her father being detained never to return, is beaten for refusing to reveal where the family jewelry is buried, and observes Germans being hunted like rabbits across a field and machine-gunned by partisans. Her family is expelled from their house on May 9 and forced to run through a crowd that beats them as they run. Later, 5 high-ranking Soviet officers find her fainted and, in an unexpected turn within such brutality, treat her with respect, feeding her and returning her to her mother. She finally manages to reach the American zone after a Soviet soldier agreed to release her in exchange for watches and rings handed over by the wounded Germans traveling with her. The entire process is backed by decrees signed personally by Beneš since he returns to Czechoslovakia in May 1945. Alas, 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 3 times alas for the Germans, we are going to liquidate them, he declares by radio in April, before even entering his country. His decrees strip all Germans and Hungarians of their citizenship and properties. Improvised tribunals, called extraordinary people's courts, take barely 10 minutes to judge a man and sentence him to 15 years in prison. 475 official death sentences are passed, 30 of them related to the Lidis massacre. By September 1945, there are some 100,000 prisoners under this system, 89,263 German-speaking, 10,006 Czechs, and 328 of other nationalities. On April 8, 1945, Vienna falls. The Red Army enters what Hitler had called Fortress Vienna after a week of combat for nearby Wiener Neustadt. Central Austria celebrates the arrival as a liberation, flying the Soviet red flag and the Austrian flag together. The women of the city do not share that enthusiasm. Joseph Goebbels had already warned what to expect, and many dismissed it as terror propaganda. It was not. The Red Army raped women in its path practically everywhere it advanced, including its own Russians and Ukrainians, but the most serious and systematic aggressions were committed against the enemy's women. First Hungarians, then Germans and Austrians. Bulgarian women, on the other hand, were partly spared the worst excesses, possibly due to a certain historical affinity between Russians and Bulgarians. Yugoslav women, on the other hand, were also victims despite formally belonging to the same Allied side. Historians who have studied this episode point to several factors that combine without excusing anything. Soviet propagandists like Ilya Ehrenburg had actively encouraged rape as a form of revenge, and according to them, as a positive factor for morale. The soldiers had seen images of the victims of Majdanek, identified then simply as Soviet citizens. The commanders in general looked the other way. When the Ukrainian Jewish intellectual Lev Kopelev tried to protect a German woman from a group of soldiers, he was accused of bourgeois humanism and imprisoned for 9 years. Stalin himself, in a conversation with the Yugoslav communist leader Milovan Djilas, downplayed the matter by asking rhetorically if it could not be understood that a soldier who had crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire had fun with a woman. The aggressions intensify, not diminish, after June 23, 1945, when many Soviet women soldiers are sent back to Russia. In rural areas of Burgenland and Lower Austria, this pattern of violence continues until the end of 1946 or early 1947. The soldiers with a higher educational level and the most veteran, according to available analyses, turn out to be, statistically, the least likely to participate in the aggressions. Those from Belarus and Ukraine, regions especially devastated by the German invasion, the most. Berlin is no different. The figures documented by doctors and historians speak of mass rapes, in some cases repeated, affecting women of all ages. Cases of victims up to 84 years old have been recorded. In hospitals, the nurses themselves were attacked while attending to other victims. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who served as a Red Army officer, wrote about these facts in a poem titled Prussian Nights. Later comes another stage, different, quieter, that of daily survival with Western occupation troops. In Berlin, a British military backpack full of provisions from the commissary canned ham cheese buns had the purchasing power of 2 cigarettes. 4 brand cigarettes could feed a Fräulein and her entire family. British soldiers received 200 cigarettes per week, which turned them in practice into feudal lords with rights of servitude over the local economy. Prostitution becomes widespread, officially tolerated but not recognized. In Nuremberg, workers had to register and pass weekly medical checks, while military government officers simply did not intervene. The reasons why a German woman ended up in a relationship with an occupying soldier were broad: companionship, protection, cigarettes, food, nylon stockings. In Nuremberg there was a woods that the writer James Stern nicknamed the Grove of Conception, full each night between 6 and the curfew of American soldiers and young German women who had to beware of military patrols because fraternization remained officially prohibited. None of this can be separated from the other. The same generation of women that survived the systematic violence of the Soviet advance is the one that, months later, negotiates its daily survival with the same men or different ones who now control every available resource: food, soap, medicine, freedom of movement. The line between coercion and choice in those years is rarely clear. and it was almost never discussed openly until decades later. In the Austrian province of Carinthia, the British face a problem inherited directly from the secret Yalta agreements. 45,000 Cossacks claimed by the Red Army and 14,000 Serbs and Croats, claimed by Tito's communist forces, await their fate in camps under British control. The Cossacks had been recruited by the Germans from Soviet prisoners of war from southern Russia, joining some former Tsarist officers and their families, about 3,000 people in total, several of whom were not even Soviet citizens and therefore did not fall under the Yalta agreements. As prisoners of war, in theory, they had protection under the Geneva Convention. That protection was, quite simply, ignored. They had fought integrated into the SS, and their last war assignment had been fighting alongside General Schörner's army near Prague. 60,000 of them were in the British zone, with German uniforms, German weapons, commanded by German generals, forming an integral part of the German armed forces, according to a report of the time, but with an additional humanitarian complication. Many brought their women and children with them. Soviet Marshal Tolbukin requests the return of these men, and the British agree. The deportations, executed by the 46th and 78th Divisions following orders from the 5th Corps, begin on June 1, 1945. The Cossacks are lured out of their camps in Spittal, Judenburg and Lienz under false pretenses. Upon discovering what is occurring, they refuse to move, which provokes heart-wrenching scenes. Women and children declare they prefer to be shot on the spot rather than be handed over to the Soviets. Some mothers tie their children to their backs and throw themselves into the Drau River. British soldiers use rifles, bayonets and pickaxe handles to force them onto the trucks that would take them to the border. When a non-commissioned officer is bitten during the struggle, the soldiers beat several Cossacks unconscious. The British also return about 900 German officers, including Commanding General Helmuth von Panwitz, publicly executed in Moscow's Red Square. A British intelligence officer, Nigel Nicholson, would later summarize the reasoning that prevailed among some commanders. There were many people who felt, well, so many millions of young men have already died in this war. What do another 30,000 matter? No one, not even Nicholson, knew with precision the exact number of Cossacks in the British zone. Only when the time came to put the men into cattle wagons did he remember his words, the prisoners sent to a German concentration camp. The Cossacks are told they will be moved to camps in Italy. They do not seem to believe it. The British officers are left visibly affected by the operation. The Welsh Guards, in charge of forcing 12,000 men toward their fate, are, according to reports, on the verge of mutiny. The entire episode would later remain silenced for decades. Germany splits into 4 occupation zones, and living in the Soviet, American, British or French zone is equivalent in practice to living in 4 different countries under the same name. Before those administrations were consolidated, the United States fiercely debates what to do with the whole country. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau proposes dismantling all war industry and turning Germany into a purely agrarian state, while the State and War Departments, with Henry Stimson at the head, defend a firm but flexible policy which avoids condemning the country to perpetual dependence. The implacable behavior of the Soviets in Central Europe, added to the certainty that 50 million hungry Germans did not serve as a containment wall against communism, ends up sinking the Morgenthau plan. Germany is rebuilt to 75% of its original territory, with much of its industrial potential intact. Each zone develops its own logic. The Soviet one combines violence and systematic industrial plundering with an unexpected personal flexibility when a commander decides he needs a specific German, Nazi or not. The American one prioritizes the bureaucratic efficiency of the Fragebogen without losing sight of the competition with Moscow for territory and technical knowledge. The British one, with resources exhausted by the war, becomes pragmatic by necessity, although capable of the same abuses it was theoretically supposed to eradicate, as Bad Nendorf demonstrates. And the French one, the smallest, carries a deep distrust of any German structure, mixed with its own calculation about the future of the Rhine. Over all four weighs the same question: how to punish a country without destroying its capacity to function, and the four different answers will open in a few years the rift that will separate Germany into two states for more than 4 decades. Nuremberg, November 20, 1945. The tribunal, presided over by the British Lord Justice Lawrence, the American Francis Biddle, the French Henri Donadieu de Vabre, and the Soviet Iola Nikitchenko. The only judge in military uniform opens the trial of the major war criminals. Göring occupies seat number 1, his last symbolic victory, while Hess fakes amnesia until he confesses without warning that he has lied all along. Prosecutor Robert Jackson calculates 5,700,000 Jewish victims. Almost all the accused deny knowing anything. Rudolf Höss's testimony about Auschwitz perturbs even Göring, who complains to Raeder and Jodl that the camp ruined his defense, and who later, seeing Austrian intelligence chief Erwin Lahausen testify about the plot against Hitler, mutters, "That is one we forgot to liquidate after July 20, 1944. Göring takes the stand on March 13, 1946, and refuses to humble himself, even assuming responsibilities that do not belong to him. He is finally sunk by a minor accusation: the shooting of 50 Allied airmen after the Great Escape. The sentence arrives on October 1. Death penalty for him, life imprisonment for Hess. Göring avoids the gallows by ingesting cyanide on the night of October 15th to 16th. The other condemned Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Streicher, Sauckel, Frick, Rosenberg, Seyss Inquart, Frank and Kaltenbrunner are executed that same night, with a hangman who misses Ribbentrop's rope and a Streicher who screams, "Heil Hitler," until the end. The bodies are cremated and registered under false names: Göring as Georg Munger, Streicher as Abraham Goldberg, so that no grave or neo-Nazi pilgrimage site exists. The 7 sentenced to prison are moved to Spandau, and with them the most visible, but not the most widespread, chapter of post-war justice closes. While Nuremberg judges the leaders, in every German town a less cinematic but much more widespread process moves forward: the daily denazification of millions of common people. The Germans nickname it Persil, after the country's most famous detergent, because it was enough to present 2 witnesses willing to sign a Persil certificate to wash any stain of the past. In the American zone alone, nearly 1,600,000 Fragebogen are processed, divided into 5 categories that attempt to order the political life of an entire nation under 12 years of dictatorship. The interrogators soon learn an almost psychological trick, asking, "Did you feel forced to join the party?" instead of, "Were you a member?" triggered confessions of guilt because no one wanted to admit conviction, but almost everyone was willing to admit pressure. The process is undermined from within by the Allies' own contradictions. The paperclip program recruits rocket scientists with promises of contracts and new life, but many end up abandoned in the western zones, without work, far from their eastern homes, as recalled by a professor from the University of Jena who lost his position, his salary and 80% of his belongings without any promise being fulfilled. By 1947 and 1948, both German testimonies and internal Allied reports agree that denazification had failed in its objective. Not for lack of processes, but because the severity of punishment depended on factors unrelated to real guilt. The trade of each person, their contacts, the commander of their zone, and increasingly whether their case arrived before or after the Cold War began to weigh more than retrospective justice. By 1946, the German mark is worth practically nothing. The country's real currency has the shape of a white cylinder, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield Players. A single American cigarette equals a suburban train ticket, an entire pack, a major bribe. Even former aristocrats lend themselves to smuggling across the green border. Franz Sein-Wittgenstein remembered selling a damaged piece of Meissen porcelain in exchange for cigarettes, and the aristocrat Libusa von Krokow traded American tobacco in the Soviet zone to get nylon stockings that she later exchanged for shoes, until she suspended the smuggling with the arrival of the deadliest winter. Heinrich Böll describes in one of his stories a typical station raid: jeeps, military police cordoning off the area, cigarettes falling to the ground by the dozens while the traffickers flee, and someone calculates with professional sadness How much money is left lying in the dirt? The railway station, often the only structure that survived the bombing, becomes the economic heart of every city. There, butter, coffee, jewelry, and forged documents are exchanged. A camera is worth a kilo of dried peas or, on another occasion, a whole goose. Soap functions as a parallel currency. Palmolive comes to cost between 50 and 80 marks per bar, and chewing gum, distributed by American soldiers, creates a generational addiction that no other European country would develop with the same intensity. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, when 60,000 Germans die of cold and hunger, there even circulates the rumor, never confirmed, of a clandestine market for babies on the other side of the Rhine. True or not, the rumor itself reveals the level of desperation. The authorities respond with constant raids, and in March 1946 the British launch Operation Second Round in Westphalia. 3 days, 188 mobile teams, 46,000 vehicles searched, 128 arrests, and a list of confiscated objects ranging from 15,000 kilos of potatoes to 10,000 combs. But out of 160 court cases opened that same month, only 15 end in conviction, hampered by German courts without enough personnel. An internal British report summarizes it without shortcuts. The cigarette had replaced the mark as normal currency and threatened the financial stability of the entire country. When General Lucius Clay tries to break that dominance by banning its import in the spring of 1947, it is too late. For almost 3 years, the real economy of Germany is measured in lucky strikes, bars of soap, and kilos of dried peas, not in marks. By 1947, something has become evident, although few say it out loud yet. The 4 occupation zones are no longer moving toward the same destination. They are moving toward 2 completely different destinations. The initial cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, relatively fluid in the first months, when the pragmatism of field officers still prevailed over the ideology of foreign ministries, erodes rapidly. The competition for German technical knowledge, evident from the first moment with the rocket scientists and the chemists of I.G. Farben, is only the first symptom of a much deeper process. The process of denazification itself becomes a weapon of the burgeoning Cold War. In the Soviet zone, the priority changes. Reliable political control matters more than retrospective ideological purity, and convinced communists, regardless of their past, find quick paths to power in the new administration. In the Western zones, especially the American one, the strategic priority shifts step by step from punishing the Nazi past to building a reliable ally against communism. The war reparations, which in theory were to be a common mechanism agreed upon among the 4 powers, end up functioning in a radically different way in each zone. The Soviet one dismantles entire factories and sends them east, car by car. The Western ones, especially from 1947 on, start investing in the reconstruction of the German economy, conscious that a country in permanent ruins does not serve as a containment wall against Soviet expansion in Central Europe. The consequence in a matter of a few years is the founding of 2 completely different German states: the Federal Republic in the West, under the leadership of the former mayor of Cologne, Konrad Adenauer, and the German Democratic Republic in the East, under direct Soviet control. The line that separated occupation zones becomes, almost without visible transition, the most guarded border on the planet during the next 4 decades. No one had planned this in 1945. The 4 victors had spoken of an occupied, demilitarized, re-educated and eventually reintegrated Germany into the community of nations as a single country. What they ended up building, without entirely intending it, was the first and most lasting battlefield of the Cold War.
What happened then to Germany after the fall of the Nazis? The answer is not a single story. It is several interwoven, contradictory stories that occurred at the same time in the same territory. There was real, systematic hunger, measured in exact calories that any current nutritionist would recognize as slow starvation. There was sexual violence on a scale that took decades to be discussed openly, especially in the Soviet zone, but not exclusively there. There was a justice process in Nuremberg that executed those responsible for a system of industrial extermination, and a process of mass denazification, much less visible, which ended up depending largely on personal relationships, practical necessity, and increasingly on strategic convenience against a new enemy that no longer wore a swastika but a red star. There was an economy that stopped using money and started using cigarettes, soap, and dried peas as a measure of real value. There was a mayor murdered for trying to honestly govern a city in ruins, and a fanatical teenager whom the same justice that executed the great war criminals decided not to pursue for simple words written in a diary. There was a distillery chemist who survived a Soviet interrogation thanks to a bottle of schnapps and the word of an ex-communist whom he himself had helped years before, and there were tens of thousands of Cossacks handed over to an almost certain death by allies who, just weeks before, had fought on the same side as them against Nazism. And there was, above all, a question that each of the 70 million Germans had to answer in their own way, without a manual, without precedent, without anyone telling them with certainty which answer was correct. What did you do during those 12 years, and what are you willing to do now to live with that? There was not one single Germany after the Nazis. There were millions of individual answers to that same question, multiplied by 4 occupation zones, 2 competing ideologies, and a country that would take whole generations to begin, barely, to look at itself head-on.